thousands of years, man observed the rising and setting sun, the cycle of seasons, the fixed stars, and those he called wanderers or planets. And from these observations evolved his notions of the universe. The naked eye extended its vision through instruments that saw the craters on the moon, the changing colors of Mars, and the rings of Saturn. The fantasies, dreams, and visions of space travel became the reality of Apollo.
We meet at a college noted for knowledge, in a city noted for progress, in a state noted for strength, and we stand in need of all three. For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. New ignorance, new problems, new dangers. Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulty, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwater of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
I know that was kind of a long intro, but those were some clips from Kennedy's speech in the early 60s. It's called the Because It Is There speech. It's got to be one of the most famous sermons in all of scientism. It's only an 18-minute speech, but there's a lot in there that I think really helps frame where I'm trying to go with this. So anyways, but a few weeks ago, I kind of got sent down this rabbit hole because somebody had shared a tweet showing some really hokey imagery that I think was just a promotional thing for the Chinese space station. But I was like, yeah, I don't think that's supposed to be real. But it prompted me to go look into what has come out. A bunch of footage and coverage of the Chinese space station, which basically got going here in 2020. And so yeah, I hadn't even really paid attention to any of this stuff, but they now have one module, basically, and it's pretty hilarious. Kind of like, it's real because it looks even faker than SpaceX. So yeah, I watched quite a few hours of these lectures that Wang Yaping, she's the first female taikonaut. So the Chinese astronauts are called taikonauts. Taiko just means space, apparently. But yeah, so it's pretty... There's so much I could say, because I started out just kind of working on this video like I was just going to talk about the hilarious space fakery that you see in terms of, just about everything from the actual rocket launch that looks kind of Michael Bay-ish. Looks a little CGI to me, especially with all these like panels falling off that are supposedly... people have made videos about it explaining why all these panels are falling off the rocket, and they're heat shields that don't even make it. But even that looks kind of CGI to me, I will say. It's like a little too many of these things falling off. And a lot of the jet, like the flames coming out, all of it looks pretty, layered or whatever. So yeah, there's all that. But then, where it just gets really ridiculous is that, okay, so in just basically 2 decades, they've gone, they've caught up from having no manned space flight, which the United States and Russia had in the, programs in the 60s, to orbiting, to putting a first man in space and doing an EVA, to then having your own orbiting space station and spending billions and billions of dollars to do all this so that you can participate in this great race for space and all the technological advancements that have been promised through that for many, many decades, right? But here you are. Okay, so you finally get some people in space, and what do? It's all about playing with water bubbles. Not even kidding. There is so many water bubble tricks, stuff that I've never seen, and stuff I don't know, man. Okay, some of them that don't even really have to do with zero gravity. It's just there's this Olympic rings thing, and they're of course doing it, being broadcast to all these school children all across China. And there's a bunch of them assembled at this space center, which I believe is in Shanghai, which is, their manned space flight center, basically. I forget what it's called. But, their equivalent of Houston is in Shanghai. But, yeah, so they're doing these lectures. Well, they call them lectures. But, basically what they do on the ISS. And they do, little school programs and answer questions and all that. But it's... this is CCP style, so... It's kind of it's everything, they're just doing all the exact same stuff, but with the perfectionist, Chinese communist performance kind of, to where it becomes, it's revealing, I will say. I think anyone who's been kind of following along and thinks this whole space fakery thing is nonsense, or the idea of questioning the ISS is just preposterous, then I strongly recommend you to watch some Shenzhou footage, just whatever. But yeah, so this Olympic rings thing, it's just changing the colors of the liquid, by adding different chemicals, and it stays in these little tracks of the rings because of surface. So it's all their quote unquote experiments are all about playing with water and demonstrating the surface tension. And also showing that, oh, look, there's no gravity, like this is some brand new concept apparently that, like, look, you can't turn around because there's nothing to hold on to, or it's, I don't know. I'm not trying to mock it but it's just, it's wild. I mean, to the point where they're doing this other thing over here, and the whole time this jar of water is sitting on a table open with, water that's just sitting in the jar because of the surface tension, apparently. And then they even kind of toss it around and it stays in the bottom because the centrifugal force or whatever. But yeah, you can even see that she's able to just kind of like stand on the ground and hold in place. I don't even think she's like hooked into a strap or anything. So whatever kind of microgravity is going on in the Chinese space station, it does actually even seem to be different than stuff we've seen before. So, but yes, in Shanghai is where they have the same thing with all the mission control, and where they train, and they have the big pool, the big swimming pool with the mock-up of everything. I mean, and it's totally not because they're filming everything in the pool. They're filming all the EVA stuff in the pool. And these spacesuits are basically just big, diving suits. It's totally not what's going on at all. Like, how does this even make sense? If you're trying to really believe that this is, like, the only way this makes sense is from the standpoint of propaganda. Why you would spend all this money and all to do pretty much the exact same things that have been going on.
Starting at 12,000 feet, the aircraft goes into a 10-degree dive until a speed of 250 knots is reached. After a pull-up at 2.5 G, a 35-degree climb results in 15 seconds at 0 G. The maneuver ends with a 35-degree dive and pull-out at 10,500 feet. In these experiments, you can see the disorientation resulting when an animal is suddenly placed in a weightless state. Cats, when dropped under normal conditions, will invariably rotate their bodies longitudinally in midair and land on their feet. This automatic reflex action is almost completely lost under weightlessness. Pigeons normally keep their bodies in a horizontal axis while in flight. These 0G birds have lost their feeling for what is up or down and point in all directions, some even flying upside down. Research in bioastronautics is continuing at the Aerospace Medical Research Laboratories in support of the space age.
They've already been done, but you have to do it, for the sake of national pride. We need our own program. We need our own, water bubbles. Meanwhile, Shanghai's been in lockdown for over a month, essentially functioning as the largest concentration camp that has ever existed in human history. And many parts of China have been locked down for months on end. So Shanghai, in some ways, is only just getting now the attention because it's Shanghai and it's, 25 million people or whatever. And this is all going on concurrently, at the same time. And that alone is enough to kind of like break my brain. But the more I've kind of been looking into this whole Shanghai lockdown and just trying to kind of get a real grasp of what's really going on and why, why is it barely getting any coverage and any attention? And I mean, that's astounding. Just even the idea, like when I'm really honest, thinking about even living in a city that size is something that's just beyond my ability to really imagine, even in a normal, quote unquote, normal circumstance. But of course, the norm in China for even pre-COVID has been quite a ways down the path of technocracy and all these Orwellian social credit things, as we all know. But yeah, even just trying to really wrap your head around that, it's hard for me, anyways. As much as I'm, thinking about these things on a pretty regular basis in terms of how things are affecting us here and in other free countries, quote unquote, free countries. I don't know, the more I thought about all this, the more it kind of struck me that, okay, when you're thinking about scientism and evolution and cosmism and all these things in a blatantly communist context in an atheistic government, right? Sure, I mean, that doesn't, it kind of makes sense. But then, yeah, listening to JFK back in 60, whatever, and at the end of it, he's asking God's blessing, for our voyage into space as we climb the mountain of space, But at the beginning of it, he's talking about how it's all about evolution, where he's saying if you take all the history of humanity, which is like 50,000 years since we climbed out of the caves, right? If that was all like a year, then all this progress with like electricity and nuclear power and blah, 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 and space is all like yesterday. And he does this whole timeline thing. That's what he's talking about with encapsulated timeline thing that he mentions. But he's preaching evolution. He's preaching cosmism. John F. Kennedy, the Catholic, oh, he's a Catholic. Oh, such a big deal because he's a Catholic, right? We ask God's blessing. Oh, that sounds Christian and stuff. Not when you actually stop and think about what the heck he's saying there for 20 minutes. How much bullcrap that was. So yeah, in some ways it's pretty wild to try and step back and look at all the history that has gone on and the back and forth between the East and the West and, China in particular. The more I learn about the history of China and Asia in general and its interactions with, Western countries, the more I learn about just history in general, the more I realize how little I understand or how little I've even known. And so that itself kind of becomes overwhelming. But for one thing, it's just not taught that much in the United States. We learn a lot about Europe and various, at least we used to. Now we're on to bigger and better things in the American public school system, which I don't even need to tell most of you. We've graduated onto, not only is God a social construct, but men and women, gender is a social construct. And, we are well into the post-truth, post-modernist multiverse of madness over here. But it's amazing how you can look back and from the perspective of recognizing like scientism as an actual religion and not just kind of glossing over it. Well, science is its own thing. Science is just science. Science is, it's learning how things work, and it's not it's not tainted by false paradigms and worldviews and philosophies and humanistic thought and corruption and eugenics and science is pristine, right? Science is objective. That's literally what people think science means, is like the objective stuff, the stuff that's undisputed. So what does that, how does that have to do with that's the opposite of religion, right? No. Like, what God is JFK talking about? Some God that, at the very least, it's a God that somehow coincides with Darwinian evolution. So is it just some sort of, does he really exist, or is he just sort of a sovereign ideal and just a word that we say to, pander to the American public because they're still superstitious about God? And we're going to sell space and NASA to them, and we got real excited about it. What a bunch of bunk, man. It's kind of a sick joke. I mean, and this is what is, I think, kind of interesting about cosmology. This is what I think makes a lot of people mad, is that it kind of throws a huge wrench in this whole idea of, nationalistic competition. And it really points back to a greater level of collusion, if you will, on a certain level within the broader military-industrial complex and the corporatocracy of all these nations that are supposedly super at odds with each other. Because nobody's calling anybody out on anything, right? Not on the real obvious stuff, whether it's NASA or 9/11 or Federal Reserve that is neither federal nor a reserve, or all kinds of things. But ultimately, what does it matter? What does all this energy that people on all sides of all over the world fighting against oppression and tyranny, if at the end of the day all we really are is just hairless apes that crawled out of the caves, 50,000 years ago? And there is no God, and there is no creator. There's no intention behind anything. It's just all biology and chemistry and physics happening. It's just particles bumping into other particles. That's all, just like I bumped the mic. That's all anything is, right? In a materialistic, scientific worldview, which may or may not, accommodate spirituality. It's always kind of the catch, right? What brings any meaning to any of it? If everything just exploded 14 billion years ago, and it's just gone from simple molecules to more complex molecules, and simple organisms to more complex organisms, and everything is essentially a social construct. Everything, every word, every concept, every feeling, everything is a social construct according to evolution. It's really the most nihilistic, the most misogynistic, the most oppressive, the most dehumanizing, horrendous ideology that has really ever been taken root, and it's in every country and in governments and institutions that on the surface are very opposed and different to one another, and competing with one another. One of the things I learned about recently was this Voices of April video, which apparently went super viral in the Chinese internet, which is super censored and everything. And the government tried to, take it down and ban it, even though it's not even really criticizing the Chinese government, but they didn't like it and they kind of took it that way. But that it just made it kind of blow up, and it, was posted millions of times and seen by like 500 million people in China, which is it's just all unprecedented. Like, what is going on in China right now is just beyond anything that even went on at the beginning of the COVID thing. And I don't hear anybody even really trying to argue that this level of extremist control is necessary for the sake of public health, especially when you learn about where these people are being taken and crammed into empty, high-rises, basically. It's like high-rise FEMA camps, but where like the toilets are overflowing and, roofs are leaking, and it's a nightmare, dude. And yet, most of our attention now is being directed towards Europe and Russia, evil Russia. And yet internally in China, externally they're talking about how, they're not involved and not taking sides. But internally in China, it does seem like it's very pro-Russia. And so time will tell. And so basically, the more I've been looking into this, not just the lockdown for the past month, but what has been really going on with China over the past handful of years. And it's really pretty amazing how much has been going on, even before COVID, in terms of kind of closing off to Westerners living in China and kind of pushing. I think that's a big part of what this Shanghai lockdown has been about. That and, sort of some faction. It's all about purging, right? Whether it's citizenry, people in the party, Xi Jinping trying to consolidate even more power, and he's kind of getting the God complex thing going on. Yeah, basically everything they're saying about Putin definitely seems to be true about Xi Jinping with his 14 principles, and Xi Jinping likes to read and all kinds of stuff.
我最大的爱好就是读书，读书已经成为自己的一种生活方式，读各类书，我想这是一个终身的爱好。满足人民过上美好生活的新期待，必须提供丰富的精神食粮。文化是一个国家、一个民族的灵魂，文化兴，国运兴，文化强，民族强。
If you thought working from home was annoying, try homing from work. You're locked inside the factory 24 hours a day and can't go back to your apartment until the Communist Party gives you permission. Truly a worker's paradise. In Tesla's case, people are literally sleeping on the factory floor because they don't have dorms for the workers. Given there isn't any purpose-built dorm, people will be required to sleep on the floor in a designated area, and there will be other spaces allocated for showering, entertainment, both yet to be completed, and catering. Worst slumber party ever.
Hong Kong has a new leader to replace outgoing Chief Executive Carrie Lam. He's John Lee, a hardline security chief who oversaw the crackdown on Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Lee was elected on Sunday with over 99% of the vote by a 1,500-strong pro-Beijing committee. He was the only candidate, which led to immediate criticism from some quarters. In a tweet, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, said Lee's election violated democratic principles, adding that the process was another step in the dismantling of the one country, two systems principle. Lee will replace current leader Carrie Lam on July the 1st. Her 5-year term was marked by huge pro-democracy protests over the increasing influence of Beijing in Hong Kong affairs. The resulting crackdown quashed virtually all dissent and undermined the city's reputation as an international business hub.
So, very interesting what is going on. And, you know, I've heard this debate over, like, the mandate of heaven idea, and is that kind of what's prompting all these crazy, you know, like, why is he so obsessed with eliminating COVID and the no COVID policy and all that? And interesting thing to think about. And it's sort of the idea that, like, throughout the different dynasties of Chinese history, there's been this idea that the mandate of heaven was like, if the gods decided that, you know, the emperor was not fit to rule, you know, that there was a need to change the regime, that there would be like a sign, like some sort of calamity or thing that would signal when there needed to be an uprising or needed to be, you know, a revolution or whatever. And that Xi Jinping is kind of fighting against that and fighting against some sort of, you know, he's trying to just prove. So it's irrational, and kind of, personally, I kind of feel like this has a lot more to do with, you know, there's a bigger picture here that it's much, you know, Xi Jinping ultimately is just a puppet like Joe Biden and Putin and Elon Musk and Bill Gates and all these people that are front and center, who are a name and a face to put on a regime or a company or a government or whatever. You know, they're just the name and the face. And yeah, they can be megalomaniacs because you kind of have to be to even, like, do that role for any extended period of time. But yeah, are they really the mastermind of the great? When you really stop and go, you're like, okay, they've got a whole space studio now. That's essentially what this is. Like, when you go back and you look at Houston, which is what Kennedy was talking about in that speech, where they were establishing the manned space flight center there near Houston off of Clear Lake. Yeah, I found one of these old film reels. I love these things. Clear Lake. I had, you know, and I feel like, yeah, I'm just learning new stuff all the time, right? I had no idea that, like, the U.S. astronauts for, like, Gemini up to Apollo and everything, they lived in, like, it was like this little community, just like an old school Hollywood, where you had the studio lot, and then you had the little neighborhoods nearby where all the actors and directors and everybody lived and worked. And so the astronauts had little houses right next to each other in this private neighborhood on the lake, and it was so picturesque and cool, and you just drive into work and, you know, train to be an astronaut. So, I mean, it was all here. Like, you have Mission Control, which is in charge of all the, you know, because you're going to put mission control here where you train the astronauts, not where you're actually launching the rockets. You're going to put mission control, and actually there's 2 mission controls, so that you can have one that's doing a real mission and one that's simulating a mission at the same time, because why wouldn't you want to be able to do that? But, like, yeah, everything where they're training and going in the pool and testing things outside, and it's all here in Houston. Then the launch pad is, you know, and the Kennedy Space Center is over in Florida. And then now, of course, you have SpaceX and Blue Origin, and they're in Texas and California and blah, 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 blah. But basically, yeah, this is a studio. This is like your TV studio control room, controlling all the different feeds. And maybe you're filming right next door. It just suggests that, yeah, not only your country has been doing that, but, like, many countries. All the so-called spacefaring nations are participating in this hoax to some degree or another. I get that is probably just as overwhelming and audacious to a lot of people as well. I get it. I get why that's difficult, but I think the more I kind of, you know, think about that idea in the context of so many other things that we see going on, where, you know, is it a real military conflict, or is it just a massive network of feeds and clips and reading off a script and press releases? And how big of a dog can you wag if you have enough people willing to go and say whatever they're told to say in front of the camera or off camera or whatever the case may be? You know, when you're talking about things that are involving a very small handful of people way up in the sky that nobody can actually verify, versus things that are going on in the ground and in cities and in countries where millions of people live, yeah, faking this stuff is actually kind of peanuts compared to a lot of the media-driven alchemy that's going on all kinds of levels. But the beauty is that, you know, we don't have to be stuck just being ping-ponged back and forth between all these humanistic narratives. It's like all these Hegelian things between like two opposing humanistic sides. You can't really fight for freedom or fight for freedom of speech or the sacredness of individual rights, human rights, unless you have a reason for why they even exist in the first place. And that is why I think scientism is so crucial to the entire, you know, whatever you want, globalist agenda, transhumanist agenda, anti-human agenda. You know, by worshiping this false idea of humanity, renders humans as ultimately having no intrinsic value, and you can do whatever you want to them. You can do whatever you want to your fellow man, if he's not created in the image of God, and not part of the family of humanity who are all ultimately related, going back to Noah and Adam and Eve. I mean, there's something, just that amount of biblical truth alone, if you really internalize that and really understand that we're all, you know, cousins in the grand scheme of things, not with primates, but with a man and a woman that God made in the garden. It's beautiful. It destroys all this xenophobia propaganda, like, in a heartbeat. Because Christ died for the sins of the whole world. And your genetics count for nothing, your education counts for nothing, your bank account, your bucket list, your stock portfolio. All these things that people look at to try and kind of climb the mountain, climb the ladder, climb the pyramid of society. It's amazing when you really think about the idea of a pyramid as kind of the ultimate prison, because it's just the structure that inevitably happens when man is put at the center of all things, and the measure of all things just becomes chaos. Really, you know, when you see the totalitarianism of a place like of the CCP, or that have existed in other places, it's just prompted a lot of reflection, I suppose, thinking about like it's amazing what has really even happened in a country like China in the past in my lifetime. You know, when I was a kid, it was, you know, my parents were still talking about like, eat your food because there's starving people in China, you know, eat your dinner. And that was kind of the trope or whatever from the 50s and 60s, because it had become that way because of Mao and his policies and, you know, his idealistic utopian versions of Marxist thought and, you know, science and evolution, all of which came from the West, you know, interestingly enough. But the name of the Chinese rocket that's taking all these astronauts up to space, supposedly, I mean, they named it the Long March. I mean, that alone, it's like, wow. I think we're on the Long March 7 now. And they keep making them bigger and bigger. But yeah, supposedly the plans are to like add more modules, and they're going to have like a little, you know, they're basically building their own ISS right as the ISS is getting ready to be retired and fall into the ocean. Just like the Skylab, you know. Dude, did you know that there was like a big old, I had no idea, this was in the 70s when they retired Skylab and they were getting ready to do, you know, when Skylab was supposedly going to fall into the ocean, there was all this hubbub about it, if it was going to fall on people, especially in Australia for some reason. Anyways, so yeah, we had Chairman Mao, and after the Apollo programs here in the United States, Nixon goes to China. Supposedly the United States went to the moon before we really, you know, went to China. It was easier to go to the moon than it was to get diplomats to China. Right, but that was where, and then it was Kissinger and all these really upstanding Washington, D.C. Actors. But essentially it opened the door for like the World Bank and all the international bankers to go in, and there was all this investment, and then eventually factories exploded and China became the slave labor supplier for the world. And countries all over the world chose to use the Chinese labor market because it was cheaper, obviously. The U.S. being right at the front of that trend, and yeah, here we are. And now in China, you use WeChat for literally everything, and you can't go anywhere without. It's so controlled. It just blows my mind. That's all scary enough, but when it comes down to then, they're literally locking people in their high rise. So after a month plus, it's supposedly easing up in Shanghai, which means you're allowed to go downstairs and walk around in the little common, gated area in your complex or in your building. You're not allowed to, nobody's allowed to go out and just wander around, but people are, of course, rising up, and people are actually finally like rising up and kind of rioting, and we've seen all that, but it's insane that like the Western media just isn't even talking about this, because we all know, how compromised it all really is here. Hopefully by now. And it's all pretty insane, because I'm not really one of these people who really takes the idea of like a World War III very seriously, I suppose, or the idea that it would even look like in either the previous world wars, which I don't think it will, but the amount of rhetoric and the amount of stuff that's going on in terms of China really closing down again after sort of 2 days where it was all open and Westerners were going in and teaching English and living there and trying to put down roots, trying to kind of establish businesses, and the corporations are still there and connected, but in terms of individual people trying to live and work in China, it's pretty much impossible. And I think this whole Shanghai lockdown is kind of a big statement in terms of once they finally are able to leave, I think tons of them are going to leave. It's a message, I think. Particularly because a lot of the foreigners live in Shanghai, which also, again, is being completely covered up, and the whole China-Russia connection is being completely ignored. And we all know what's going on here with the supply chain and the food processors and fertilizer and inflation and blah, 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 blah. So, yeah, the cyber World War III, the siege, the long march, whatever you want to call it. I feel like it's not just coming, but yeah, we're entering into something, a purge. How many people have just been disappeared? How many political dissidents have just been carted away in a van and are never seen again? I mean, it's chilling when you really think about that's the reality. All the stuff that like Yuri Bezmenov was talking about in his lectures, where we go, oh yeah, that's all the Soviet Union era stuff with the KGB, and suddenly that's all front and center in the minds of so many people when it comes to like, Putin's ex-KGB, and not understanding that is going on in China like day in and day out. Nobody cares because we build Teslas there and a million other things, iPhones and a million other everything. And Elon Musk is he cares about free speech, but doing business in China. Yeah. How's that work? Fortunately, we don't have to put our faith in politicians or billionaires or space icons, space puppets, taikonauts. Man, that is interesting though to me too, that like even in the Chinese iteration where they chose taikon, but they still had to put the naut, cosmonaut, taikonaut, astronaut, and even in JFK's speech he says, we ask God's blessing as we set sail, and there's always this nautical aspect to it. Ever since the 50s and to the present day, there's this nautical sailing thing that always remains, which I think is very interesting. Does that have to do with maritime law kind of stuff, which is a whole interesting topic that I don't know a whole lot about, but know enough to know that there's all kinds of shenanigans that have been going on, however many centuries now with maritime trade and creating sort of an international law for ships and trade and all the stuff that has gone on. Yeah, going back to the Opium Wars with the British East India Company and American companies and families as well who made pretty massive fortunes through the opium trade, including one of the founders of the Skull and Bones Society. some of this collusion goes back a long, long way. And we just keep updating it for the new generation, for the next step towards something.
不幸与上海没有关系，现在也不会有关系。对当前上海的历史事件，我们将珍惜。
大病急性封上3、5天啊，封上1周不行吗？不行，为什么不行？因为上海，我们这个城市承载了不仅仅是上海人民自己的上海。我们这个城市还承载了在全国社会经济当中发挥了重要的功能。我想我们全部的上海市民应该有这样的大局观。
没办法，现在嘛，让我通知人家阳性，现在看云上嘛是个阴性，我们都让人家打123去投诉平台，搞什么搞嘛？
现在连上海发布微博上面都关。4点多钟就来了，到现在都几点了？这个菜是不是要全部烂掉？水也没得喝，上海有小卖部没有？吃也没得吃，我是来支援的。无偿的，我现在我连微博都知道，我们有普通的居民、普通的朋友们，他们收到大礼包，上面印的是宝山区政府。你让我们作为宝山区大场镇的居民去做核酸，